This is the Sony ZV-1. Yeah, I said Z, I'm Canadian. Anyway, I've been playing with this camera for a couple weeks now, and I have some pretty strong opinions on it. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and this is A Tasty Burger. So when I decide if I'm going to recommend a camera, I like to look at what else is out there and see if it does something more for the same price as the current offerings, does the same for less money, or fills a specific need at a fair price. And in some ways, this camera does all three. Spec-wise, it's surprisingly similar to the a6600, which is Sony's flagship APS-C camera. This would just be the 1-inch version of that camera. But as an owner of the a6600, I can say that this camera operates pretty much identically in terms of the menus, features, and video capabilities, including all the benefits the a6600 has over the cheaper APS-C models, like IAF and video. But it also has a lot of the same quirks and limitations. Ergonomically, it's obviously a bit more limited compared to the bigger APS-C bodies. It has fewer buttons and less customization, but I think the layout is pretty smart on the ZV-1, and it only took me a couple hours to get used to it. The buttons are small, which can be tough for larger thumbs, but the big record button on top is appreciated. And for the size of this camera, I'd say that if they just managed to squeeze in one more function button, it'd be perfect for what it is. It records in 4K up to 30 frames per second and 1080p up to 120 frames. It comes with a fully articulating screen and a non-interchangeable lens that provides the full frame equivalent of a 24 to 70mm field of view. It's a 9.4 to 25.7mm that ranges from 1.8 to f2.8, but the depth of field is going to be much deeper than a 24mm 1.8 because of the 9.4mm focal length. So you're looking at something closer to an f4.5 depth of field equivalency when wide open. But this lens doesn't stay at f1.8 for very long. Basically, as soon as you touch the zoom rocker, which is extremely sensitive by the way, even on the slow setting, it drops to f2. And by the time you hit a 27mm equivalent, it's at f2.2, then by 28mm, it's at f2.5, and then by just 32mm, it hits its f2.8 maximum. So this lens is predominantly an f2.8, save for a few millimeters on the wide end. One cool thing is that when in photo mode, it displays the focal length in full frame equivalency as you zoom, which is great. But unfortunately, it doesn't do this in video mode, which is a bit of a bummer. Speaking of that zoom sensitivity though, it does get quite a bit smoother when you're actually recording, and you can get some good results capturing a zoom, but during shot composition, the zoom is nearly impossible to be precise with. The lens is fine. It's not the sharpest or most refined lens I've ever tested, but it's certainly not among the worst either. It has minimal focus breathing and reasonable compensation for distortion, with acceptable aberration. On the wide end, you get a respectable 1 to 3.5 reproduction ratio at a focus distance of about 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and the rendering is pleasing enough to produce some satisfying close-up photos while traveling light. The telephoto end is no good for macro, but it does maintain its sharpness pretty well throughout. Just keep in mind that from about 32mm to 70mm, this lens is an f2.8, which is closer to an f7.1 full frame equivalent. It does have a built-in ND filter, which is pretty great. You get about 3 stops of reduction when applying it, and that definitely helps preserve some background separation when shooting outdoors by preventing the need to stop down your aperture even further. The ND filter applies quickly, can be assigned to a button, and doesn't have a noticeable negative impact on the quality of the image. It has a single SD card slot, which defaults to exFAT when using an SDXC card, and does not suffer from that 4GB file splitting like some other point-and-shoot cameras do, which is great because the camera also has no record time limit. In fact, you can pretty much record indefinitely on this camera, or at least until your memory card fills up. The battery will last you about an hour and 10 minutes in 4K with autofocus, but it can be actively powered over USB using the micro Type B connector, and it's not just that trickle charge technique on the other Sony cameras where the battery still goes down, but slower. In this case, I waited until the camera was completely dead, then tried using it again right after with the USB cable connected, and it ran for another 2 hours and 45 minutes with zero battery before it finally stopped because my SD card was full. The battery still needs to be physically inside the camera. You can't run it exclusively on USB power, but it can seemingly survive even long after the battery is dead as long as the USB is connected. Thermals also don't seem to be a problem, but just make sure that you set the temperature setting to high. If you leave it on standard, it will shut down to heat quite quickly, but on high it lasted for hours. I had it running for 6 hours doing back-to-back recordings, only taking a 10-second break to format the card. The temperature warning came up, but it never shut off. This was a room temperature environment of around 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. It took me on average about 2 hours to charge the battery from completely dead, and the battery and SD card are stored in the same compartment, accessed from the bottom of the camera, which is actually my first major pain point with the ZV-1. It has one of those battery doors that can't be opened if you have anything screwed into the quarter 20 on the bottom, and I mean anything. The hole is only 1mm away from the base of the battery door, and it actually opens up over the quarter-inch hole. This is incredibly frustrating if you need to access your SD card, because you have to unscrew the camera or your quick release every single time, which kind of defeats the purpose of a quick release. You could transfer your files via USB instead, but that method doesn't work if you're traveling and like to manage your SD cards in a specific way. The quarter 20 isn't even centered under the lens. Had it been, there would have been more clearance. Now, this likely would have caused the body to be a little taller, and thus they probably avoided it to save space, but I think this is a major mistake. It's frustrating enough that I'd almost not buy this camera for that one reason. Anyway, getting back to that excellent runtime performance, it made me think that the ZV-1 would make for the ultimate live streaming camera. It's light at only 288 grams, so just over half a pound, so it can be mounted anywhere. It has a clean HDMI out up to 4K 30, has terrific autofocus including IAF for video, and it lasts indefinitely on USB power. In fact, I did a nearly 2-hour live stream with it and found it performed excellently. It does have a couple issues though that prevent it from getting the title of perfect live streaming camera. First of all, the background separation isn't great. It's better than a phone or webcam, but it's still a 9mm lens, so you're going to be getting a pretty deep depth of field. Second, because of the sensor size, the low light capabilities aren't the greatest, and the images can be pretty soft at times under anything less than high key lighting or outside in daylight. But I found during my live stream that I was able to remedy that decently with a little bit of extra sharpness in OBS. You could also increase the detail in the camera to address the softness as well. But the main thing that really disappointed me about this camera for live streaming is the limitations when switching to 30p. You lose your face detection when switching to 4K 30 while you have the HDMI connected. Now this is an old Sony issue that's been fixed for some newer cameras, including this one for 4K 24p, but it's still an issue across all their cameras, including the A6600 for 30p, which means you're forced into this big zone type autofocus, which works but has a greater chance of being distracted by other things in the frame. It's good if you like to constantly hold things up to the camera. In fact, Sony even lets you activate this mode by choice, calling it the product showcase mode, because it allows you to quickly focus on objects that you hold up rather than the focus staying glued to your eye. But for talking head live streaming, I'd rather have face detection, and that's not an option 4K 30 over HDMI. Like I said, it is available in 4K 24, but sites like YouTube stream in 30 frames per second, so you're going to introduce a lot of judder if you capture in 24p for a 30p stream. Now the same workaround that I discovered quite a while ago using the 4K only output select mode in HDMI settings still works on this camera, but that only works if you use specific 4K capture cards or route your camera through an Atomos recorder first, which really inflates the cost of what could otherwise be an affordable live streaming option. Now, I'm told that Sony is planning to release software to turn the ZV-1 into a webcam for your computer over USB, which could potentially bypass all these HDMI limitations, but I don't currently know anything else about that software, what limitations it will have, and if it'll play nice with programs like OBS. All I know is that it's slated for summer 2020. But getting back to the HDMI, the ZV-1 also has the recurring issue with Sony cameras where when you have HDMI connected and you record internally, the back LCD goes black. This is something that's been addressed on the flagship models, but it's still present here. And of course, the HDMI output is limited to 8-bit 422, just like on other Sony mirrorless cameras. Now, 1080p is an option for 30 frames per second live streaming, and when shooting 1080p 30 over HDMI, you keep face and eye detection. In fact, it works up to 1080p 60. It only stops working at 1080p 120, where it defaults back to that big zone box again. So that's definitely a viable option, but that softness issue I mentioned earlier will be even worse in 1080p. However, 1080p also shoots a little wider. 4K, regardless of the frame rate, has an added crop of about 10% or 1.1 times, but the 1080p gives you the full width even at 120 frames per second. The crop is also increased if you activate the digital stabilization. There's 3 modes in the steady shot. There's off, where no stabilization is applied, standard, which just uses the lens stabilization but doesn't apply an additional crop, and then active, which combines the lens stabilization with the electronic IS, and which does add an additional crop of about 17.5% in 4K and 24% in 1080p. So when in 4K with active stabilization, this equates to a total additional crop of about 1.275 times by my testing, making your 24mm equivalent lens look more like a 30mm lens, which of course brings up the question of vlogging. Now, how wide you like your field of view is up to you, but I know for many vloggers out there, 30mm would be too tight. In fact, I know some vloggers that think 24mm is too tight. Of course, you could always turn the active stabilization off to get a wider field of view, but that kind of defeats the purpose of calling it a vlogging camera, being forced to use a less stabilized image just so you fit everything into the frame. Kind of disappointing to be honest, considering that they got everything else right, with the fully articulating screen, the built-in ND, and this little wind floof that clips into the hot shoe to protect the new microphone design on this camera. But hey, maybe the standard lens stabilization is enough. Let's go for a walk and find out. Okay, so we got both cameras here. The one on the left over there is the ZV-1, and this one over here is the A6600. I've got a variable ND filter on the A6600 to try and keep it consistent with exposure, and I've got the ND turned on obviously on the ZV-1. I've got the audio levels each set to 17, and there's some background noise going on. There's a road over there, and there's some people playing basketball over there, even though they probably shouldn't be right now. and that will help us see how the sound isolation is on these two microphone arrays. Both of these cameras are using autofocus, and they're both set to wide with the eye and face detection turned on, and it seems to be tracking okay. And I'm really shaking the A6600 quite a bit more when I'm holding them at full distance like this. It's actually quite heavy, where the ZV-1 I can hold at full arm's length without too many problems, which is good because it does appear to be quite a bit tighter than the A6600, which has the Sigma 16mm f1.4 on it, and I have a cage on it because I didn't feel like taking it off, and that adds quite a bit of weight to it. Over here on the ZV-1, it's just the camera and its flip out screen and the attached lens, and I have the little wind muff on it that came with the camera because it's fair, it comes in the box to see how that affects the audio. On the A6600, I have just the in-body stabilization because the Sigma 16mm lens doesn't have any lens stabilization, and on the ZV-1 right now, I'm doing both. It's on the active mode. I'll switch that halfway through, but this will work as both an autofocus test, a stabilization test, I'm walking backwards now for some reason, and an audio quality test. And I can use this audio test as a perfect time to tell you about today's sponsor, Storyblocks. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you needed some footage but shooting it yourself would either be budgetarily or logistically unfeasible? Well, Storyblocks has you covered with an impressive collection of stock footage covering a wide range of subjects with unlimited downloads and 4K video. They're also amply supplied with backgrounds, overlays, and After Effects templates, and the interface is easy to use and navigate, and the clips are royalty-free for both personal and commercial use, so you can use them as much as you want, wherever you want. So if you think you could take advantage of a fantastic library of quality stock footage and effects, check out Storyblocks using the link in the description below. Okay, so a little bit more on the stabilization. I'm going to change over to just the standard stabilization on the ZV-1, which is basically just lens stabilization. And you can see how much of a difference that makes. So this is the A6600 with the Sigma 16mm f1.4, just in-body image stabilization, nothing else going on. See how stable this looks. This camera also has pretty bad rolling shutter, where the ZV-1 does not. Now this is the Sony ZV-1 with the active stabilization, so both the lens and the digital IS. And it seems pretty smooth in the screen. And also this camera has much better rolling shutter performance, so I think overall it should make for a smoother look. Okay, now we're using the ZV-1 again, but this time with just the standard stabilization, so the digital is turned off, but the lens stabilization is still on. Now we're getting a much wider field of view, which is nicer. And at full arm's length, I think that this is sufficient for vlogging. One thing though is that you have to stop the recording. You can't change from active to standard while recording, so something to consider anyway. My observations are that just the lens stabilization does produce a pretty good result by itself. The active stabilization mode is definitely better, but when field of view is an issue, I think you can get away with just the standard stabilization. And just the standard on the ZV-1 is much better than the IBIS on the A6600. Autofocus-wise, both performed identically and perfectly adequate for any vlogging scenario to hold your face and eye well. And sound-wise, I'd say the ZV-1 was definitely clearer, but it also seemed a lot more dynamically limited. The A6600 retained a lot more of the spectrum of my voice and richer tone, but it was also much more vulnerable to background noise and wind. Sony says the ZV-1 comes with their latest 3-capsule mic designed to allow clear capture of the subject's voice from the front while minimizing background noise, and the noise control is definitely noticeable when compared to the 6600, including the camera's self-noise. I measured about a 10 dB lower background noise with the ZV-1 over the A6600. But I also think the ZV-1 lacks clarity when noise isn't a problem. I recorded a vocal sample here in my sound-treated studio on both the ZV-1 and the A6600, and I think the 6600 sounded much better and way less boxy, even if it was a bit noisier. It seems the ZV-1's overcompressed and isolated sound is better suited for a noisier or outdoor environment, but not as good for quiet indoors. Again though, the ZV-1's noise performance is excellent, with a floor in here of minus 68 dB versus the minus 58 dB on the A6600, with both cameras set to 20 for the audio record level in camera. In 2005, it's revealed that the Nightmare has manipulated the Hulk for years, and it's implied that some or all of the Hulk's adventures written by Bruce Jones may have been just an illusion. In 2006, the Illuminati decide the Hulk is too dangerous to remain on Earth and send him away by rocket ship. Also, as I mentioned in the vlog test, one thing that's been drastically improved on this camera over something like the A6600 is the rolling shutter. The ZV-1 has almost no jello even during ridiculously fast pans, which is highly appreciated as it's a huge weakness on the larger sensored Sony cameras, and it also really complements the vlogging use case for the ZV-1. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into autofocus because I've covered Sony AF so many times. It's using the latest stuff Sony has, so you're getting the real-time tracking, which is incredibly sticky and can be activated with the touchscreen. It has class-leading face and eye detection resolution for both photo and video. It's very responsive and very consistent. And speaking of the touchscreen, it's fine. Nothing to write home about, it gets the job done, but like other Sony cameras, the touch controls are pretty lackluster other than for selecting the focus point, and there's no viewfinder on this camera. One interesting thing about the touchscreen though, is that when you open it up, it turns on the camera. Finally, when it comes to image quality, it's better than I expected. The only criticism I can make is that it's a bit soft. When you use a profile like PP7, which is S-Log2, it has the detail all the way down to -7 by default, which is a bit insufficient for this camera since we're not getting that 6K APS-C oversampled image. So like I said before, you'll either have to increase that detail or add some sharpness back in post. I prefer the latter. Also, when shooting outdoors, as you could see in the vlog test, the softness is not as big of an issue as it is indoors, likely because the noise reduction isn't as aggressive since your signal is sitting much higher than the noise floor when outside in the sun, and so the noise reduction isn't softening the image as much. And in that scenario, you can get away with a -7 detail. But for something like live streaming, you'll definitely want to sharpen it up. But it's pretty great that it does have picture profiles and S-Log2, and it's able to impressively retain highlight detail for a 1-inch sensor. It's obviously a little limited in the dynamic range, and you can see this the most in the shadows due to the higher noise floor. You definitely have to push the exposure up to pull your shadows out of the mud, where the A6600 is more flexible and cleaner here. But overall, it's not too bad and should perform quite well in adequate lighting. The colors are good too. We're seeing the latest and greatest version of Sony colors, so we're getting really good results on the vector scope and better skin tones than earlier models, and it matches really well with the more modern Sony releases. It's just not as detailed or as low light capable as the larger cameras, which brings me back to my opening statement. Does it do something more for the same price as the current offerings? Yes, it's going to be selling for $750 until the end of June, then going to its regular price of $800, which puts it cost-wise somewhere between the A6100 and the 6400. And when compared to those, it comes with a lens, IAF for video, a built-in ND, stabilization, fewer quirks, and over the A6100 specifically, it has picture profiles where the 6100 does not. It also has similar battery life to those cameras and built-in interval shooting for creating time lapses. Number 2, does it do the same as another camera for less money? Yes, when compared to the A6600, it has pretty much all the same functionality, save for fewer buttons and dials, and the 6600 does have a headphone jack, where the ZV-1 does not. The A6600 also has the big battery, so it's going to last 2.5 times longer than the ZV-1, but the ZV-1 strikes back with built-in ND, continuous USB power, and a significantly lower price tag compared to the $1,400 of the A6600. And of course, those prices for the A6000 line all increase when you add a lens into the equation, and if you want even remotely comparable stabilization, that'll have to be a stabilized lens. Lastly, does it fill a specific need at a fair price? I'd say yes. It struggles here a bit because it doesn't completely nail those specific needs. Like I said, the lack of face detection in 30p for live streaming hurts it, and the tighter than ideal field of view for vlogging hurts it for that need as well. But the fact that it's essentially ready to go out of the box for both of those functions for $800 is pretty compelling. And we didn't talk about photography much, but it would also serve as a great pocketable hybrid camera for traveling, giving you pretty comparable photographic features to those APS-C bodies as well, with the convenience of having it in a pinch if you don't want to lug around your big gear, or if you just want to step up your quality from your phone photos and videos. But despite it satisfying those needs reasonably well, I still think it's worth considering the APS-C options. The A6400 is only $200 more with a kit lens, and you'll get a much sharper, more detailed image with better shadows. You'll just have to slap on your own ND filter and stabilize the camera yourself. But the A6400 route will also give you much more flexibility with lens selection, so you can break free of the 24 to 70mm restriction and the not so shallow depth of field. Putting something like the Sigma 16mm f1.4 on your A6400 will give you a true 24mm equivalent at a constant f1.4, which will give you a much sharper image with much better background separation for about $1,300 total. And if you're willing to give up picture profiles, you can do the same thing with the A6100 for $150 to $300 less than the A6400, depending on the sales at the time. Now that's quite a bit more money than the $800 for the ZV-1, but I do think it's worth it if you have the cash. But considering the size difference between this and the APS-C cameras, I am impressed by what Sony was able to cram into this tiny body. And if you're on a tighter budget and you need to get up and running right away, the Sony ZV-1 is a very viable choice and easily one of the best cameras available in this form factor. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%. Yeah, alright. I'm done.